Hello, and welcome back to Chapter 2, Section 2. We're going to be talking about religion and reform in the 1820s and 30s. Here are your learning targets for today. We're going to explain what the Second Great Awakening was and the impact of it. We're going to describe some discrimination that religious groups faced, and then we're going to talk about the social reform movements that stem from the teachings of Christianity in the Second Great Awakening. So the Second Great Awakening began on the southern frontier around the turn of the century. Let's talk about it spreading south first. Highly emotional camp meetings that were organized usually by Methodists or Baptists, but sometimes by Presbyterians, became a regular feature of religious life in the South and lower Midwest. On the frontier, people lived far apart, so these camp meetings met social as well as religious needs. For many people, this was the only way to get baptized or get married or to have a communal religious experience, was to attend one of these camp meetings. In the North, it was mostly Northern evangelists that formed societies devoted to the redemption of the human race in general and American society in particular. And Charles Grandison Finney was one of these influential revivalists. Finney was relatively indifferent to theological issues. His appeal to the people was for emotion rather than to doctrine or reason. He wanted converts to feel the power of Christ and become new men and women. He eventually adopts and moves to the extreme view that redeemed Christians could be totally free of sin, as perfect as their Father in heaven. And beginning in 1823, Finney conducted a series of highly successful revivals in towns and cities of western New York, and he spread from there. He sought instantaneous conversions through a variety of new and controversial methods. These included holding protracted meetings that lasted all night or several days in a row, placing an anxious bench in front of the congregation where those in the process of repentance could receive special attention, and encouraging women to pray publicly for the souls of male relatives. Sometimes listeners fell to the floor in fits of excitement, and although he appealed to emotion, Finney had a practical, almost manipulative attitude toward the conversion process. He said it's not a miracle or dependent on a miracle in any sense. It is purely a philosophical result of the right use of constituted means. Some new churches that come out of the Second Great Awakening are the Unitarian Church, which was a drastic difference to the preconceived ideas of Christianity, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Mormons, who start in New York and move westward from there all the way out to Utah. One reason why people work for social reforms is this Second Great Awakening. The Mormons faced religious persecution as we move on to Learning Target 2, so they had to keep moving. They did some practices that were frowned upon by other churches, like polygamy or having more than one wife. So they had to isolate themselves and move from place to place, and they eventually move all the way out west where they could practice religious freedom to Utah. Joseph Smith was murdered by an angry mob, so Brigham Young picks up his mantle and takes them out to Utah, where Brigham Young University is now located, and where the basically the headquarters of the Mormon Church, called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is headquartered. Catholics mostly come from Ireland. There was not a big Catholic population, and the ones that were coming are poor Irish immigrants who were looked down on by other workers because they could work for less. So immigrants coming and taking the jobs of Native Americans, not Indians, but Americans who were born here, are looked down upon, and therefore Catholicism was looked down upon as well. And then the Jewish people escape political unrest in Europe, but they have already faced discrimination here because state constitutions are heavily leaned toward Christianity, And some of the state constitutions already made required public officials to be Christians, so Jewish people could not represent themselves. Something else to know about reform and discrimination was the Sabbatarian controversy. Reformers said that the federal government should ban business and mail on Sundays since it's a day of rest, but the separation between church and state should make people to be able to work on Sundays and deliver mail on Sundays. So Congress compromised. They banned mail on Sundays, which still continues to this day, but not business. They can still do business on Sundays. People can still do business on Sundays. So in the 1820s and 1830s, reformers became aware of the danger to society posed by an apparently increasingly number of criminals, lunatics, and paupers, or poor people. Their answer was to establish a special institution to house those deemed incapable of self-discipline. Their goals were humanitarian, but in practice it was much less than that. They believed reform and rehabilitation were possible in a carefully controlled environment. In earlier times, the existence of paupers, lawbreakers, and insane persons had been taken for granted. Their presence was viewed as the consequence of divine judgment or original sin. So for the most part, these people were not isolated from local communities. The insane were allowed to wander about if harmless, and they were confined at home if they were dangerous. The poor were supported by private charity or the dole provided by towns or counties, and convicted criminals were whipped, held for limited periods in local jails, or executed for very serious offenses. But by the early 19th century, these traditional methods had come to be seen both inadequate and inhumane. Dealing with these deviants in a neighborly way broke down as economic development and urbanization made communities less cohesive. At the same time, these reformers were concluding that all defects of mind and character were correctable. The insane could be cured, criminals reformed, and paupers taught to pull themselves out of destitution. So this is the invention and establishment of special institutions for the confinement and reformation of deviants. So the 1820s and 1830s sees an emergence of state-supported prisons, insane asylums, and poorhouses. And in theory, these prisons and asylums substituted for the family. But in practice, the institutions were far different from the families that were idealized by these inventors. The most prominent feature was the imposition of a rigid daily routine. But these prisons and asylums and poorhouses did not achieve the aims of their founders. The results were overcrowding and the use of brutality to keep order. For the most part, prisons failed to reform hardened criminals, and the primitive psychotherapy known as moral treatment failed to cure most asylum patients. And poorhouses rapidly degenerated into sinkholes of despair and poverty. A combination of naive theories and poor performance doomed the institutions to a custodial rather than a reformatory role. And conditions would have been even worse had it not been for Dorothea Dix. Between 1838 and the Civil War, this remarkable woman devoted her energies and skills to publicizing the inhumane treatment prevailing in prisons, almshouses, and insane asylums, and to lobbying for corrective action. And as a result of her activities, 15 states opened new hospitals for the insane, and others improved their supervision of penitentiaries, asylums, and poorhouses. So she is one of the most practical and effective reformers of the pre-Civil War era. Now, the temperance movement also comes out of this Christianity, the Second Great Awakening. So since the American Revolution, whiskey had become the most popular American beverage. It was cheaper than milk or beer, and it was actually safer than water, which was often contaminated. In some parts of the country, rum and brandy are also popular, and hard liquor was frequently consumed with food as a table beverage, even at breakfast, and sometimes children drank along with adults. And so these reformers blame the poverty, sickness, and family abuse on alcohol. But some states pass laws limiting the sale of alcohol. This temperance movement is different from the one taking place in the 1900s. But there were some states that passed laws limiting the sale of alcohol. Indiana is the last state in the union that bans alcohol sales on Sunday. And finally, we come to education reform. Intellectual training at school was regarded as less important than moral indoctrination. So we want to teach our people how to be good citizens rather than teaching them the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Sometimes a school served as a substitute for the family. Educational reformers were alarmed at the masses of poor and immigrant children who failed to get the proper nurturing at home. So the schools take it upon themselves to make up for this disadvantage. Otherwise, the entire republic would be in danger from masses of people incapable of self-government. Public education is most developed in New England and least developed in the South, where almost all of the education is private. The most influential supporter of the Common School movement was Horace Mann of Massachusetts. He's a lawyer and a member of the state legislature. He works tirelessly to establish a state board of education, which each state has now, and adequate tax support for local schools. He believed children were clay in the hands of teachers and school officials and could be molded to a state of perfection. Like the advocates of child rearing through moral influence rather than physical force, he discouraged corporal punishment except as a last resort. His position on this issue led to a bitter controversy with Boston schoolmasters who retained a Calvinist sense of original sin and favored a freer use of whipping with a rod. So Horace Mann believes that by teaching middle-class morality and respect for order, the schools could turn potential rowdies and revolutionaries into law-abiding citizens. They could also encourage social mobility by opening doors for lower-class children who were determined to do better than their parents. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. I hope you got all your learning targets filled out.